Okay, today I'm on a Zoom call with Emmet Kennedy. Thanks very much for agreeing to talk to us, Emmet. Best known for, well, I'd say best known, maybe not for the Final Furlong podcast. Been a huge success. What do you attribute it to?
Oh God, the incredible listenership and the incredible loyalty of that listenership, and I think the dynamic and the chemistry that I luckily have with my guests, which makes the show appealing, and also the fact that it's informative, but it's also entertaining. We're not a bunch of clowns. Well, I suppose we are. Well, I am anyway. To a certain extent, but I think that I think the show flows quite well. And yes, it can be quite long, but it's interesting when I shorten it, people complain. When I go over long, people complain. The beauty of a podcast is, and that's one of the reasons I love it over radio, is that if Jane Mangan is making a very interesting point, I don't have to go, sorry Jane, just we gotta cut to traffic. Pete, what's the latest? And that's commercial radio, so you can speak for as long as you want about whatever eloquent point it is that you're making, as long as you're making an eloquent point. But it's the audience, it's the listenership, which is just fantastic.
Yeah, that listenership, it sort of takes some working out really, because obviously you've got an awful lot of fans. They like the format, like you say. Sometimes it could be 3 hours plus. You'd also have to be extremely interested in racing to tune in the first place. And most people that keen aren't. You see them on Twitter, they don't really want to know everybody else's opinion. So what you got to find balance perfectly right there, haven't you?
Yes, Simon. Yes, we do, and hopefully we can keep it that way. I mean, when I started the Final Furlong podcast, it's probably 6 years ago now. There wasn't a show of that ilk at the time. So when I began the show, I was working commercial radio. I'd been working in commercial radio since I was 16. I'm very blessed to have been given the opportunities that I've been given so far in life, and continue to be given, thankfully. But I was listening to Football Weekly with James Richardson, who was on that show at the time, and Gabriel Marcati and the Game podcast. And I thought it was really interesting that there were journalists talking about football, and I liked it, and I liked the dynamic that the presenters and the pundits had, and I liked the fact that it could break out into a row at any second, or just break into absolute hilarity at any second. So I went looking for a racing podcast, and there wasn't any. With the greatest respect to Simon Rowlands, because I know that Simon had a big hand in Timeform Radio, and Timeform Radio was great, but the podcasts that they were pushing out was the only thing that was available. But it was very much, well, Timeform have this horse rated at and such, and that's fine. And if you like that kind of thing, great. I use Timeform, but I also use Racing Post RPRs. I use the official ratings. I use as much data as I possibly can. I don't just stick to one thing. And so I decided to start a podcast that was like, the way I described it was, it's a show where you've just been at a Cheltenham preview night, but it's been a fairly high-end Cheltenham preview night, but now everyone's blathered, and you've taken your tie off, and you're in the pub afterwards, and the audience are there with you, and you're talking away about the sport, and the audience are listening along with you, and they can join in the conversation if they want. And obviously, our listeners can't just jump into the conversation, because that's not possible, although I'm sure that many have shouted at the speaker over the years going, "You clown, why would you say that?" So I think that it's the mixture of it being informative, for one thing, the winners that have been tipped on the show, but it's not just about winners, it's about it being informative and entertaining, and then that blend of guests and pundits. Like Rory Delargy is just, Rory's first class. He's absolutely brilliant. Jane Mangan is the best Irish pundit I think that the racing has right now. And I think racing's in a very, very lucky place at the moment that it's got such talented people like Nick Luck and Ed Chamberlain and Lydia Hislop and Sean Boyce anchoring it, and Gary O'Brien, I should mention as well. But also some fantastic talent in terms of writing about the sport, like Chris Cook and Lee Mottosed, and brilliant pundits like Roy Delargy and like Jane Mangan, and Kate Tracy, who should get a very strong mention as well, who's a firm member of the family now too. But we also do, or I should say that I also do, long form interviews with people like owners, trainers, jockeys, and I think they can be very well received as well. So racing does itself down an awful lot, and it's a huge sport, and it's got 2 dedicated TV channels, and it's got a multitude of bookmakers who want to take your money, and there's a lot of them who are doing quite well. So the sport's got fans, and we saw the pictures at Cheltenham, which were very unfairly, I think, used. We won't even go back to that during the Rona times. Back in the old days, when we can all go outside and hold hands and hug and live life normally. And I think that I've managed to tap into that audience, and that's been the case and it took a while. It took a while to get there, but now that we're there, and there are a number of other racing podcasts, but now that we're there, I think we've managed to stabilize and try and stay there.
Now, you mentioned you were one of the first, if not the original, racing podcast after Time from Radio. Was it originally done as like a financial proposition, or were you doing it because you loved it?
God knows, pure love of the game. I had no idea that this show would become a show that a site affiliated with Sky would want, and that now that the Tote would want to sponsor, and that big companies would want to advertise on now. I really didn't have any clue what I was doing, to be honest about it. I was a commercial music radio presenter and a massive horse racing fan, and had been a massive horse racing fan since I was a kid. My mother ran a bookmakers and ran several of them, and was on duty the day that Frankie had the Magnificent Seven. So I was quite young and barely enough to remember it, but I remember just her telling me about an old woman having a 10p Super Heinz on all of Frankie's minutes, and taking the prices as well, and that my mother had told her, take the prices, make sure you take the prices, because back in those days there was no best odds guaranteed, and anyway you would have been screwed in the last race if you hadn't taken the 20-1 or 33-1, whatever price the Frankie's last winner was. But my late uncles, God rest them, and some of my uncles who are still very much around and kicking, like Jack and Brendan and Uncle Paddy, were interested in the sport as well. So I wasn't born into racing. I just I kind of fell into it, if you like, in that regard. I fell into it as a fan. For a brief period of time, I did get to do some show jumping, which meant that I got to learn the personalities of horses and learn that, they're like any animal, almost like any human. They all have their own unique set of personalities. Some can be lovely and gentle, and some can be utter, insert colorful language. And I wanted to talk about racing on my show. I was doing a sports show on a Sunday afternoon on 96 FM. I was working 5 days a week for 96 FM in Cork, doing 5 hours a day on air. So I was responsible for a lot of hours, 5 hours a day, 5 days a week. And then there was the prep work in between. And they pulled me aside one day and said, "We don't want you talking about racing anymore." And I was like, "What? Why?" Cork has a race course. Don't know if you know this, but there's a big following of racing in Cork. And like every street you went onto, there was a betting shop. No, we don't want you talking about it. So listening to those podcasts, Football Weekly and the Game podcast, I decided, well, screw it. Maybe I could start my own show. And I looked into the logistics of what it would be like to start a podcast and what was involved in it. And some fairly tedious details to go through, but also assembling a team then to start the show with as well, and booking various different guests and being ballsy enough and brave enough to go and book trainers and ask them would they come on the show. And it started to work. And then eventually Horse Racing Ireland came along and they became a sponsor of the show. And that was for a few months. And then after that, it kind of went quiet for a bit. And all of a sudden, At the Races came out of nowhere and said, we quite like your show. And they flew over to Cork to meet up with me. And the rest is kind of history. I think that the show's independent now, and with the tote, and with that, I have a greater sense of freedom to be able to go and say what I want. Like, racing TV is a very good product. Whereas I was kind of restricted from saying that previously. And there's no doubt that being affiliated with ATR and such a gigantic site, and great people like Matthew Taylor and working with great people like them definitely helped boost the show. Because I think that once we were sponsored by ATR, that gave it credibility. And I remember to this day reading a tweet one night from Ed Chamberlain saying, listening to this on the way home from Sky Sports, it's absolutely brilliant. And I nearly fell off my chair. And he was talking about an episode that we'd done. I can't quite remember what the episode was, but he tweeted a number of times, and he was kind of restricted about what he could tweet because they wanted him just tweeting about football. But he was a big supporter of ours, and there were some others as well who promoted the show on social media too, and we wouldn't have had big followings back then. So getting ATR to sponsor the show gave it a credibility and gave it, I guess, a status to a certain extent as well. But I never for 1 second did I dream that the show would be what it is, what it's become. There was no grand plan. I didn't concoct some idea when I was 6 years ago when I started the show that I'm going to excellent. I'm going to build a podcast into being this juggernaut of a thing. I just wanted to talk about racing, and it's maybe the fact that I'm a fan who wanted to talk about the sport is one of the reasons why it's popular, because people want to listen to a sport that they like.